There have been many changes in life over its long tenure on the Earth, but undoubtedly one of the most remarkable changes was the development of multicellularity. What is a multicellular organism? Well, a multicellular organism is generally one made up of cells that have irreversibly differentiated or altered to carry out specialized functions. For example, in us, we might have cells that are growing into liver cells, some cells that become skin cells, and cells that do other functions. These different diversity of specialized cells come together to make the whole human organism. This is generally what multicellular organisms are. At some point in the history of life on Earth, unicellular organisms or microorganisms transitioned to become multicellular. How did this happen, and when did it happen? For the first 2.5 billion to 3 billion years of life on Earth, there were only microorganisms. This evidence is preserved in the early rock record in controversial microfossils and chemical signatures. These remnants of early microorganisms become better preserved as the rock record improves through time. And then between 585 million years ago and 542 million years ago, fossils begin to appear in the rock record that suggest early multicellular organisms. What is the earliest evidence for these multicellular organisms? Well, some of the first records of multicellular creatures are found in the Ediacaran fauna. These are fossils preserved in rocks between 585 and 542 million years ago. They're very enigmatic creatures, strange, tubular and frond-shaped organisms which lived during this period, and many people think that these were experiments in early body plans, experiments that would eventually give rise to the body plans of multicellular organisms that we're familiar with today. These were first discovered in Australia, and this is an artist's impression of these creatures and what they may have looked like those many millions of years ago. How did multicellularity arise? Well, at some point, single-celled microorganisms made the transition to multicellular organisms. We don't quite yet know how that happened. It's one of the great questions in astrobiology to fathom out how multicellularity evolved. There are two possible explanations. One is an internal change in cells, and one is possible environmental change. The internal change may have occurred by some alteration in the genetics. At some point when cells were dividing, they divided in such a way as to differentiate. Some change in the genetic code caused cells to change their functions but remain in communication with one another, such that a mass of previously almost identical single-celled microorganisms became a mass of differentiated cells, an early multicellular organism. But one would still have to question why that happened. What triggered this genetic differentiation within cells, this emergence of multicellular features? Another explanation is the rise of oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere. Oxygen makes possible aerobic respiration, whereby organic material is essentially burned in oxygen to produce energy. Aerobic respiration is a very good way of generating large quantities of energy, and it allows for things like running and jumping and even running a brain. So aerobic respiration may have been key to multicellular organisms. The rise of oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere to similar levels to today may have allowed large complex organisms to evolve and develop. Once it did evolve, why did it remain around? Why was it selected for? Well, as Charles Darwin said, it is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is the most adaptable to change. Multicellularity may have been advantageous in several ways. For example, increased size would have allowed organisms to escape predation and competition from other multicellular organisms. So once it did emerge, it persisted because it was necessary for organisms to escape already existing multicellular organisms. Multicellularity may also have allowed organisms to exploit new ecological niches, regions where there were resources or food supplies perhaps not being efficiently used by other types of life, allowing life to expand into new physical and ecological territories. Cellular specialization is also quite energetically efficient. If cells specialize in one particular function in an organism, they can do that function very efficiently and very well, and thereby direct their energy to that particular function. Multicellularity may also have allowed for physical protection from the external environment, protection from other predators, but also protection from physical extremes. There were also computational advantages. multicellular organisms were able to develop much more complex behavioural characteristics, which would have allowed them to have competed more effectively, to have hunted out new territories and new food supplies and new resources more efficiently. We have to be careful in interpreting these changes as necessary for organisms to compete. We know that many microorganisms are energetically very efficient. We also know that they can survive in extreme environments very well and also compete with other microorganisms. So the reasons that multicellularity both evolved and persisted in the environment are still controversial and one of the questions to be addressed by astrobiology. One of the more remarkable transitions in the fossil record occurs 542 million years ago, when we start to see fossils appearing in the rock record that represent a huge diversity of multicellular organisms. This period in the rock record is called the Cambrian Explosion. One of the reasons why the diversity of multicellular organisms may greatly increase in the rock record at this time is thought to be because organisms began to evolve the ability to precipitate minerals used for skeletons and shells. And once these skeletons and shells became preserved, we begin to see a greater diversity of life in the rock record. Before that, multicellular organisms were in general soft-bodied, and those soft-bodied organisms are not well preserved in the rock record. So the Cambrian Explosion, this increase in the diversity of multicellular organisms in the rock record, may be an artifact of preservation, but nevertheless it shows us that this was a period in Earth history where the diversity of multicellular organisms, including their ability to be preserved, was greatly increased. I've given you perhaps some idea that life on Earth is rather continuous. We've gone from unicellular microorganisms to multicellular life right the way through to the present day. But it's important to remember that multicellular organisms, as probably with microorganisms, have been subject to mass extinctions in their past. Since the rise of multicellular life, we recognize 5 big mass extinctions in the rock record. They have different causes, and the causes of these mass extinctions are very controversial, another area which is a very active field of investigation in astrobiology. For example, the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction 65 million years ago is thought to have been caused by an asteroid or comet impact. Other mass extinctions have probably been caused by changes in the environment other than asteroid and comet impacts, for example from volcanic eruptions. All of these causes are a matter of debate. But after each extinction, biodiversity on the Earth has always recovered or increased, showing how resilient life on Earth is to these large environmental changes that are capable of causing extinctions. Extinctions may not always be bad for all life because, of course, extinctions create spaces for new organisms that survive to flourish and emerge into empty habitats. For example, the destruction of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago allowed mammals to dominate the surface of the Earth, eventually leading to human beings. So extinctions are a double-edged sword. They result in the destruction of large swathes of diversity of life on Earth, but they also open up new opportunities for life to expand into those empty niches and habitats. So what have we learnt in this lecture? Hopefully what we've learnt is that unicellular organisms prevailed for about the first 3 billion years of life's history. Fossils from about 585 to 542 million years ago seem to comprise the first evidence for multicellular life, at least experiments in early body plans. Multicellularity arose maybe as a result of interactions between cells, genetic changes within organisms themselves, or changes in atmospheric conditions, such as a rise of atmospheric oxygen. The advantages of multicellularity may have included an increase in size and specialization, physical protection from the environment, and even the conditions for the development of more complex behavior, which would have enhanced their ability to compete in the environment. The Cambrian Explosion, as recorded in the rock record, shows a great diversification of life, including the appearance of hard-bodied organisms in the rock record. And finally, mass extinctions on Earth have been followed by periods of biological recovery and diversification, but extinctions have very much been a fact of life for multicellular life since it first arose.